Good morning. Let's get started again. And I'd like to introduce Louis, I hope I pronounced it right, Bettencourt. I met Louis the first time in Tokyo in November 2010 when he gave a talk at a conference organized by the Riken Brain Science Institute. I'm not quite sure that Iriki Yatsushi is here because he organized it, together with IPL and Santa Fe Institute. And amongst other things, Louis at that time talked about science maps and the maps that show the relationship between different fields of science. And one of such beautiful maps, I tried to get a picture of it, but I couldn't. That was reproduced in Wired Science with the title, "The Pursuit of Knowledge Has a Shape." And I can advise you to look it up at internet, the Wired Science picture, because it's really very, very beautiful. Later I read about Louis in an argument with, or arguing with, I'm not quite sure how to put that, with Jeffrey West on the need for a grand unified theory of sustainability with cities and urbanization at its core. And I mentioned these two totally different areas of interest to illustrate Louis' broad range of interest. But Louis's great depth too, because last November I was in a meeting at Santa Fe and there he talked about physics and complexity, addressing the question, does the individual matter in complex system? And I will gladly leave that answer to Louis, because I know what he said then. I'm not quite sure that he will say the same now. But please welcome Louis Bettencourt for his talk.
Thank you. Is it on? You can hear me? Good. So thank you, Jan, for the opportunity of being here above all, but also for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be in Singapore. It's my first time to see, how such a wonderful mixture of people and ways of operating a city actually works. So this talk, let me just qualify a little bit more on how this talk came about, just to give you context. And so every 6 months we have Santa Fe Institute sort of wide meeting. And at those meetings, usually there's some theme that the chair of faculty picks. And this theme is reasonable, but sort of picked out of a bit of a hat. And it's very general. And so the idea then is that the speakers, usually in the faculty, have to sort of improvise on the theme. So this talk is a little bit, forgive me, musicians yesterday, they gave us such a wonderful concert. But it's a little bit in the same spirit that you're given a question. The question was, to me, does the individual matter in physics, though the idea is in complex systems. But the background to it really is that we do not have a unified way of looking at complex systems. And when you're coming from physics, in which many people, of course, in complex systems come from physics and try to use physical theory to describe complex systems, or when you're coming from biology or even the social sciences, you actually have a very different fundamental perspective on what the ingredients are, how they interact with each other, and what makes the system tick. And so today, with this question, what I really want to get to is how do these very different lines of thought, how can physics and biology both be right? So I think that after 2 days of very interesting conference, I hope you're stimulated, but you should also be very confused, because you've seen people talk about networks, about the brain, about the wonderful chemistry of the cell, about human societies and economic development, and you'll hear more of that this afternoon. But do we really have, if you understand any of these systems, suppose you did have a very good theory of them, so that it's actually quantitative and predictive, things like physicists like, perhaps, would you actually understand the others? And we tend to proceed by strict analogy, or close to strict analogy, by saying that, we've used this. Is an organism a city, or is a city an organism? Or is it an ecosystem? Or is the brain doing computation like a supercomputer? And we all know that all these analogies are flawed. There's something that we're missing, they're too shallow. So hopefully this talk will also give you a way of thinking about what it is that's common to complex systems, and perhaps what level of analogy you need to operate at in order to translate insights from one to the other, and hopefully even what a theory of complex systems might look like. So what I want to start is what I told you already, which is how can physics and biology be both right? So these are the two greatest theories that we have at present in science. We know that physics certainly has told us what the world's made out of, and perhaps how it evolved from the Big Bang. It's the most successful. It's helped us build technology that runs all this. But there's the sense in which perhaps most of physics actually deals with aggregates and with averages of different kinds, and I'll get into that a little bit as I get into the talk. But there's the sense in which a lot of the constituents of physical systems are actually not to be treated individually or even in small groups. They're treated in terms of macroscopic ensembles, like the gas in this room. And there's something sort of a little bit antithetical to the spirit of all the wonderful structure that we may want to describe and understand that physical theory, sort of as a point of departure, doesn't seem to capture. On the other hand, in biology, it's almost the opposite. I'll be telling you a little bit how biology, and specifically evolution by natural selection, really is an informational theory. And what it does is basically emphasize that things happen, evolution happens, because of the individual. The individual is the unit of selection. It's genomes and the body that he builds, the phenotype and its behavior, is actually what gets selected, and this is a mechanism for information to get transformed and passed on and replicated. So this really emphasizes information, emphasizes structure, and to some extent fitness, which remains a very hard concept to actually pin down in many circumstances. So it looks like you go, at least from this perspective, all the way to thinking that every individual matters, everything that happens to this individual matters. So how can these two things have anything to do with each other, and how can they be parts, at least, of how we understand complex systems? So this is the puzzle, and this is hopefully the set of questions that I'll really be answering today, at least give you a way of thinking about them. So let me start with physical theory. This is sort of my education, but it's also my point of departure. And I think it's interesting to go through a few things because often when we think about models, mathematical models and mathematical theory in complex systems, we more or less explicitly carry some of the baggage with us of how we've learned to do physical theory. So does the individual matter in physics? Just to answer that question, the answer, of course, is yes. But I hope that this slide, as crass as it seems right now to you, actually will make sense by the end of the talk, and that there'll be some subtlety to it. So let me just go on and leave you with that question. So as I said, when we talk about physics, we tend to rely on three major ingredients, particularly when you talk about statistical physics, which is what I'll be talking about. There's massive redundancy. We tend to average over macroscopic quantities like 10 to the 23 particles. And we tend to understand the universe in terms of the same bricks, the same constituents, quarks, leptons, and the things that we know the world's made out of. And these things, what's special about them is that they're all the same. They're in different places, they interact in different ways, they can form different things, but they're all the same bricks, and there are only a handful of them. The other thing that's very interesting, and that's quite antithetical to complex systems, is that when we describe a physical system at a macroscopic level, we tend to rely on asking for it to be maximally disordered. This is usually asking for the state of maximal entropy, which is the way in which you usually do equilibrium statistical physics. And finally, and this is central to the ultimate discoveries of particle physics, but also in a lot of places where we have great theory in condensed matter and other applied systems and materials, we rely on the idea of symmetry. We want a theory that actually accounts for all the things that can be interchanged in no matter. That's sort of one way of trying to make theory, is to understand what other things that matter, like energy, but then what are all the transformations in terms of the things that made up that system that you can do that allow us to write the same energy, and therefore by understanding those symmetries, we understand a lot about the system and what it's made out of. So when we look at complex systems, though, the words are completely different, right? They tend to be structure, function, information, perhaps. And so again, there seems to be a contradiction. So the question is, how do we solve this dilemma? And I'll start where Jeffrey started, because this is really, I guess, the beginning of physical theory, as we know it in modern times. So the way we understand, of course, gravity, which is the first, I guess, force that we understood well, is because there was a lot of data. That was sort of interesting that in the decades and perhaps century before that, and of course historically, there was a lot of data about the stars and the planets. And so there were sort of regularities that we knew, for example, in the form of Kepler's laws that held very well statistically. We didn't know how. Kepler had very exotic ideas about platonic solids and other things about how that could be. And of course, there was this very eccentric person, Newton, who had a great idea. He postulated there was an invisible force that no one could actually see, and that would hold over vast swaths of space, bigger than anyone could imagine, and would have certain geometric characteristics. That was what was important. And that all this diversity, the big ball of shiny gas, all the turbulence in Jupiter, as Jeffrey has shown you a wonderful movie of, life on Earth, none of that matters. All that matters is just the aggregate mass of those systems. So by making these extreme simplifications, these extreme assumptions, I guess you could say, this is how we understood how gravity works and how the solar system works, and we put things on orbit, and we understand eventually much of our cosmology. So that's one kind of averaging. It's just to say all that matters is sort of the total charge, the total mass of a system. And many of the ways in which, so this point about information is that all the ways in which that thing is organized inside, whether it makes a big swirl or it has life, really doesn't matter. But perhaps more subtly, the beginning of the tools that we use now in complex systems are in statistical mechanics. So the idea is, can we understand why things sometimes don't matter? And how to go from the elementary particles, whatever they are, the things that are the fundamental degrees of freedom, the pieces, the individuals, if you will, and these macroscopic properties. And so this is sort of always the thought experiment that you learn in basic physics. And it's supposed to be a box of gas. A box of gas has particles in it. These particles are supposed to be identical. And they go around this box, they collide with the walls, and they collide with each other. And in doing this, of course, if you're probing the walls, you experience pressure, and you know that you may know what the mass is inside. And by knowing these things, a miracle happens, right? The miracle of averaging. And this miracle is that you go from something that has 10 to the 23 individuals or something like that, which is, a liter of gas, and you end up being able to describe this and being able to operate on it and build engines and build things that change the world based on three quantities, basically. These quantities are just the volume, the number of things in it, or the mass, and the temperature, which is a measure of how much energy there is in it. And when you think about this, this is really quite extraordinary, that you could have this massive reduction in how you describe the system. And often, implicitly or explicitly, this is usually what we're looking for in systems biology or perhaps in neuroscience, when we look for dimensional reduction and ways to start to describe a system that has many parts, many interactions in terms of a smaller and smaller number of degrees of freedom. This seems to be a viable program in physics, but we have actually no idea how often this is viable, justifiable, a good thing to do in many other complex systems like living things, the brain, human societies, and other things. So this is obvious, this is physics 101, but it's still an extraordinary fact that you could understand a lot about the world by just knowing those few microscopic quantities. And this is the beginning of how physics is tractable and perhaps simple. But as you know probably, but also as I'll show you, this is the beginning of the problem, is that there have been a couple of assumptions that were made in there that were very problematic at the time, but they are the ones that you have to step back from. And if you do that, you'll start having a real theory of complex systems. That's a long story, so let me just go a little bit through physical theory in very broad strokes, and then come back to that and start telling you how to build something that looks more like biology and looks more like other things that we want to describe. So just to formalize some of the things I already said, what happened is that we use these sort of concepts of maximal simplification in several qualitatively interesting ways. So we want to understand, so in some sense, we ask for maximal redundancy, only averages Sometimes the mean, sometimes we have to take into account also the variance. But only these things matter. We don't care about all the statistics of what's going on inside. So for example, the temperature is just the expected kinetic energy of the particle. We also ask for maximal disorder. That gas could be in all kinds of configurations, so that's what I mean by disorder. But it's really the fact that some configurations or some kinds of configurations are much more likely than others, the one in which the gas is more or less uniformly distributed, that actually is characteristic of the mean. And so that's really all that you need to know for most purposes. And that is a state that's maximally disordered. There's always more ways of having a system disordered, as you know if you have kids and have to deal with that bedroom, as there is to have the system ordered. And in order to produce order, usually you have to spend energy. And finally, you tend to have, when you deal with physical systems, you understand that even the way things interact, so now the structure interaction space, can be very simple. And with very simple models, they usually, so this is a famous Ising model of little magnets that basically interact with each other and like to align or anti-align. This is sort of the workhorse of phase transitions in statistical mechanics, if you ever learned physics. So this system, which basically just asks for each one of these little balls, which are an abstract degree of freedom, to align or counter-align with the arrows around it, actually displays a lot of variety and applicability and describes many physical systems, or versions of it too, from magnets to water boiling, perhaps, to many other systems that display material phase transitions. So there's a lot you can do with very simple assumptions and with very crass and enormous averages. Okay, so, and this has an important word for a physicist, which is both sometimes an overreach, but it's also very important. This simplicity is encaptured by the word universality. It means, in plain language, that a lot of the details don't matter. You can get away with a few fundamental simple assumptions, such as these, and the way, if one of these spins is just slightly different, or if you had an interaction with some of the same character, but it will be a little different, there's probably an infinite number of such interactions you could prescribe. Doesn't matter if you want to describe the macroscopic behavior of the system. So this is universality in physics. I'll come back to other universalities that deal more with information and computation and show you that these are important and they're telling you some of the things that don't matter, but they're not enough. And so just to say what that system does, I'll show you this. This is very famous. This is the Ising model. It's basically the blue and the black, sort of the background white, and that's changing color, and the white and the black are just showing you areas in space where those spins are aligned or counter-aligned. So you can think of these as a magnetized region and a non-magnetized region. And as you change temperature, which is denoted here by color, they're getting jiggled around more strongly relative to the interactions. And so when it's hot, it's more disordered like this. The domains of black are smaller. And when it's blue, you tend to have bigger ones. And this is sort of the beginning of structure, if you will. It's statistical structures. The statistics of these blobs, but it's structure, but it's simple. And many people have used this, for example, for describing herding of wildebeests, or for describing stock market coordination, or for describing many other things that are beyond the realm of physics. But the question is, are the structures that you can encode in this sort of configuration enough to describe such systems? And the answer usually is obviously no. There's something missing. But I'll show you as well that if you step back from some of those assumptions, that system right there can describe anything. Okay? So hold that in mind and just think about what is it that I need to break in there in those assumptions so that I can describe something that's arbitrarily complicated. It's sort of an interesting thought experiment. This is true. It's called a hopfield network. Okay. So let me continue on that. I'm giving you some clues about where I'm going just to keep you guessing a little bit, perhaps. But the thing that went wrong with physics from the beginning, and with statistical physics, I should say, is that this idea of massive redundancy that tells you basically that there's, for example, an equation of states, such as this one, which is for ideal gases, which, again, an idealization, but works very well in many ways, that the pressure, so the force on the walls, and the volume is related to the temperature. And this allows you, of course, to build all kinds of engines, to have industrial revolution, change the world. When people actually started looking at these machines, they realized that they were very, very, very inefficient, right? So James Watt made his name, and I'm not sure if it's fortune, because he actually made it slightly more efficient. But we're talking about efficiencies of about a few percent. You could change the world with that. Keep that in mind. There's just a little bit of change in the way you manipulate the system can really have huge implications about what you can do with it. But at the same time, this issue of efficiency was always bothersome. Why is it that we cannot achieve much higher efficiencies? What is it that we need to do? Is this in the assumptions of how we deal with the system? Is it to do with the system itself? Or is it to do with us? And this is actually very interesting. I'm sure social scientists will appreciate this because it's the beginning of where subjectivity enters physics, which is not supposed to, right, when you learn physics and engineering. But it does. Okay, so I'll just take you through the end of physics very quickly as to what you know all this. But it's important to keep in mind of how far we could have gone, we have gone with these ideas of redundancy, disorder, and symmetry. So this is used, of course, to understand the microscopic world of particle physics. This is an early experiment on the bubble chamber. And this is basically the stuff that you see in atomic and subatomic particles. And the point is that although these patterns are actually very beautiful, they're also very predictable. So there's a magnetic field, particles go through, and they go through, as you see, in straight lines and very curly lines. And so depending on your charge and your energy, you will end up with a different trajectory, and you could just infer those things. So we know that all these particles are in a few families, they have certain masses, they have certain charges, and you can do all that. And this is a massive modern version of that, heavy ion collisions. And the point about this, which is supposed to be an early state of the universe, a quark-gluon plasma perhaps, is that the same thing happens just on a massive scale. So this program of understanding what the world is made out of is really predicated on the fact that the world is made out of similar things behaving in similar ways. And that by doing this, we've discovered what is inside everything. And I had to show this because, of course, Murray Gell-Mann, who's one of the founders of the Institute, as you've heard, is responsible for all the dark blue part of this is the standard model, the constituents of matter in the whole of the universe. And so the dark blue are quarks, and the G is the gluon, and so that he's responsible for almost half of the standard model. But the idea is that the world in the end is actually made out of a few things. These things are all the same, so there's massive redundancy. And you can deal with understanding much of what the world is in very simple terms, in terms of individuals. They're just all the same. And of course, we find this intensely creepy in society. So this is another clue that there's something wrong that's different when we start looking at human societies in biology. But in physics, we like it, okay? So again, is this wrong? Are physicists kind of, in this realm of people, or what is it that's wrong with this view of the world? And so the idea then is that when you start coming in the opposite direction, when you start making things up again, of course, there's this combinatorial possibility that many things can start to happen. The first place where you really see that is that when you combine quarks and protons and so forth, you end up with nuclear chemistry, and that gives you all the elements. That's limited, but already creates certain diversity. And of course, once you go into the realm of chemistry, you start having many more possibilities. And when you start combining the products of chemistry, you get even more and more things. But still, the program of physics is that you can do this wonderful thing. This is the whole history of the universe in simple terms. You can come from an era where everything is supposed to be made of the same things, not even quarks and gluons, but the same, perhaps, string excitations, when it's very hot. You cool things down, just like opening that box and making it cooler and cooler. And as this happens, you create these aggregates that they're still all the same. They're basically nuclei and atoms. The zoo keeps increasing. But by the end of it, you start creating these very soft entities made out of mostly electromagnetism and gravity. And these things are the world that we have around us. And these things have built into them this combinatorial way that they can exist in many possibilities. And that the changes in energy that relate to those possibilities are pretty soft. And so this possibility of creating complicated things is appearing, but physics doesn't quite deal all the way with that. So Here's another example of how we understand physics based on symmetry. It's just a crystal. It's another system, of course, we can understand perfectly because it's very regular. It's always the same idea. And of course, more subtly perhaps, we can understand many other structures even in complex systems. Like this is, of course, a mathematical tree, but it looks a little bit like a real tree. In terms of things that, again, are the same, now they have a certain compositional characteristics. So it's a bit more sophisticated in some sense. But these things repeat themselves and create structures that are very interesting and they might describe, for example, that. So the way people understand river basins is that that same structure repeats itself again and again and again on larger and larger scales. And if you ask for this sort of structure to minimize energy dissipation, you actually get a very good model of the Amazon. Pretty incredible. Same, very simple principle. And of course, Jeffrey and colleagues did this amazing work on trying to understand if, and propose and in fact explain why metabolism is related to this sort of structure and that this is maximally efficient in the way organisms deal with energy. Okay, so that's physics. Okay, I know I give you a little bit too much physics, but I think the interesting part is that how much, that you could understand the whole universe, you can run machines, and all this relies on these very simple assumptions that you can deal with things on averages and assume a lot of ignorance and a lot of disorder. But all these things that we want to describe in complex systems seem to, again, to be in a different category. So what is missing? And so the first thing that's missing is that if you now think of other structures that start to become the products of chemistry, of course, and eventually of society, these structures are still, in some sense, all the same, but they're not, right? Because, for example, DNA molecule, as you know, DNA is information. The point is that it's not all the same. They have the same composition of A, T's, G's, and which one I forget, C's. But basically, the fact that that configuration is subtly different matters a whole lot. And so, in that sense, although these things are all the same at some chemical level, I guess statistically, the fact that they have different configurations, the fact that they can code for something in detail, is starting to tell you that they're not individuals in the same sense, and that these configurations will matter a lot. That will be the basis of selection. So that's really the difference, is that what you're dealing with it now is actually something that is information. It's not just matter and energy that you want to understand in terms of their averages and their maximal disorder. You actually will have to end up caring about what these sequences mean. And so this sort of perspective is actually starting to pervade physics in interesting ways. And it's coming in through string theory and quantum physics. This is a quote from John Wheeler. I'll read it to you because you might not be able to read it. But it's really speaking in terms that are very biological. But he's not talking about biology. He's talking about quantum mechanics. So he's talking about, it's a famous quote. It's called it from bit. And every particle, every field of force, even the space-time continuum itself, perhaps, derives its function, its meaning, its very existence entirely, even if in some contexts indirectly, from the apparatus elicited answers of yes and no questions, binary choices, bits. So the point now is that when you start thinking of physical degrees of freedom in relation to something that measures them, which you can think is something that interacts with them, it's really the configurations in which those physical systems are in that start to matter. And that really is what information is. That is there in physics all along, is that a lot of the times when we're doing physics, we don't care about it, or we can deal with the fact that we can assume it's in some maximally disordered state. But if you start to care about complex systems and what they are and what to do with them, this matters a lot. So the question is, how does it come about? And can we start understanding these systems with the same language? So let's see. So let's go back to the beginning again, indulge me. And what's the problem with this, right? In fact, the problem is not here, because your eyes can track every particle, where it is, and so forth. So your eyes, in some sense, have full information. But when we built theory for that system, you build a theory that did not have such information. And that's called, basically, the fact that you assumed that the system had a certain entropy, a certain level of disorder. So you chose to be ignorant, in some sense. And, of course, that is the concept of entropy, which is the way physicists started encountering this issue. And so, as you know, it's interesting to ponder on the many interpretations of entropy, because it was a very strange concept from the beginning in physics, and I think remains somewhat mysterious when you think about it in terms of information. But the earliest very interesting and very insightful descriptions of it is that basically this is unusable heat. It was something that you could not get out of these machines in order to produce work. So you were trying to increase the efficiency of these engines, but you could not get more than a certain amount of work out of it. And so the rest, this heat that you lost, was basically expressed in terms of this magical quantity called entropy. It's a little bit like the story of the neutrino in physics. It's something that you cannot really, something that's missing, and you have to give it a name in order to conserve energy. But the fact then is that Maxwell, who was always more sophisticated, started saying something that actually is closer to the truth we understand now. But it also has language that doesn't sound like physics, which is that entropy measures our ignorance of the state of individuals. So because you assume this disorder, because your eyes no longer can say where each one of those particles are, then you have actually chosen, in some sense, perhaps it was imposed on you, but you've chosen to be ignorant. And it's, in some sense, that ignorance that's costing you that amount of work. So that's sort of the lesson. If you could be less ignorant, you could do more work. And that's really an interesting insight. Okay? So, and this idea, of course, the ultimate one in physics, that entropy is disorder, is the same idea from Maxwell, but actually Gibbs and Boltzmann put numbers to it, gave us a way of calculating it. So here's the thought experiment that you always still taught, but it's always taught as a paradox. But I want to take it then a bit further into the structure of complex systems. So this is called Maxwell's daemons. It was one of the ways in which Maxwell, that I introduced before, was that gentleman over there, one of the great theoretical physicists of all time, and one of his greatness is trying to deal with this problem, among other things, like electromagnetism. But here's the problem. So it has that box of gas again, and he just divided the world of particles into two types, reds and blues. And blues, I guess, are supposed to be colder, and red are supposed to be hotter. So they just travel faster. But the idea is that somebody called a demon, he actually didn't call him a demon, but that's how it became known later, because it posed a paradox, and it seemed perverse. That demon basically chooses which particles are hot and which particles are cold, because it knows that, and divides them into one half of the box and the other half of the box. So if you have that knowledge, you can produce a configuration like this. So you can trade knowledge for actually work. Now you have a temperature gradient, and you can extract work from it. And that means you actually can run that engine at greater efficiency. You can extract a little bit more work out of it. So the answer, the rationale for this is that more power, you got more power, more stuff that you can do with it for equal resources in some sense. You just had to have this information. So there are very material advantages, not just fanciful advantages, to knowing more. And those advantages allow you to do more things with energy and matter. And of course, this is really what complex systems do. They have, as I'll be telling you, complex systems are ways in which several natural systems and artificial systems built by us are able to actually learn about the world in certain ways and use that knowledge, that information, the words are a little slippery, in order to do something that's better and to be more efficient and to grow the economy and to grow more matter and so forth. So let me take you now through that. So one of the lessons for this, and the reason why, for example, nanotech is so interesting, is that if you could know more about the world of materials, the physical world, not just operate at the macroscopic scale, which is where these heat engines used to operate, then you actually have to know more. And by knowing more, you can build machines that are much more efficient. So for example, we already do this with transistors. We've been basically making them smaller and smaller and smaller so that the energy per operation is actually much smaller. So that is the efficiency of already chips in your computer. But that's just one very simple process by which you can go down that line. There are many other ways, and we know, of course, bacteria and other cells do it, but we don't know exactly how because we don't have that knowledge. Okay. So before I go into that and start talking about that in a way that's more unified, there's another universality that's very important. So when we start talking about information, and you know this, there are two related other kinds of information, which is this idea that information, these zeros and ones in your computer, the bases in your DNA, those are all embodiments of information, but actually that doesn't matter. If all you need to know is that sequence can exist in a way that is basically independent of what it means. It's just, that's basically Shannon's communication theory, or information theory, it's known modernly. So it's the idea that if you know something about what information you have in the beginning, what you have at the end, something about the channel in between, then you can actually transmit this information in a way that's statistically predictable by knowing just a few general things about the system. You don't have to know its details. And Turing, this is a lot in one slide, but Turing was, of course, as you know, one of the founders of modern computer science and the way we understand computation. And the idea is that he also shown that computation, the manipulation of information, is actually also independent of the substrate. You can do it with cogwheels, you can do it with billiard balls, you can do it with transistors, you can do it with the machinery of the cell. It doesn't really matter. What matters, of course, is how fast you can go, how efficient you can go in terms of energy, but it doesn't matter fundamentally. So these are other universalities that tell you that information is actually a very slippery quantity. It can be encoded into the configurations of many different things. It can be manipulated by many other different things. So don't get hung up whether by having a computer that does a certain thing is much better than a brain and so forth. There's really a sense in which if you knew what to do, and if this is provably, computation, you could do it with anything. It just may take you longer and so forth. So here's now, so what happens now is that what is it that we have to step back from to integrate these quantities, information, matter, and energy? So I want to go back to the other model, which is this model. It looks very different now. This is a little hokey. I got it from YouTube. But it's basically showing that that model I showed you before that used to produce blobs, depending on temperature, can actually produce any black and white image. It could be other colors if you're a bit more sophisticated. But this is basically recalling an image, which is a fancy night or something. And then it will produce another image. But you see that this is now very different from those blobs. It's actually stuff from the world. If you had made the system actually bigger and nicer, you could have written any image in there. You can provably say that. And how is it that that system that used to only be able to do blobs is now able to encode anything, any image, so all the complexity of the world? And the answer is that these systems now have learned to structure themselves differently. These are networks. These are systems where the interaction of each one of those degrees of freedom, of each one of those spins, is now structured. Those interactions were learned from those images. And you can show that these sort of systems actually can learn a number of different images that goes with their size. So there's a sense in which those very simple models of physics, when you step back from these assumptions of maximal disorder and symmetry, can start producing any structure that you want. So you just had to go back and say, where is it that I can put information? What do I need to break in physics in order to start doing that? And so if I can start doing this now systematically, I have a system that can encode information and has a trade-off of matter and energy, and that can keep going. So each individual now matters. Each interaction in this system is a little bit different from each other one and reflects the statistics of these images. And you can start seeing that these assumptions that everybody is the same, everybody interacts in the same way, need to have to start to go away. But also that this information, that this structure comes from somewhere else, comes from a system that these other systems are learning and interacting with. So in some sense now, if I can make sense of all this big mess of physics, computer science, and so forth, in order to describe a system, you need these, essentially, describe and operate a system, you need these three quantities. Physics, in some sense, has been very successful at telling us about the world of matter and energy under the assumption that you go to a corner of information and say, information is really very simple. Everything tends to be maximally disordered or be in some other configuration that we already know. We're going to assume that. But in fact, and of course Einstein famously proved that matter and energy are ultimately equivalent in some sense. But this is actually insufficient to describe the world as a whole, and it's insufficient in particular to describe complex systems. The other things we've learned is that in some sense, information, though it's agnostic of its substrate, is always physical. It's always in a hard drive, in a genome, in your brain. So this is called Landauer's principle. And it tells you basically that information and matter are intimately connected. They're not one-to-one, but they are related. You cannot have disembodied information. That's very important. And the other part is that there's a cost and there's a benefit to information. This is the stuff of thermodynamics, but it's also the stuff of modern computations. Try to understand what is the trade-off between the energy that you spend in order to record information and to access that information. And so a theory of complex, and finally, of course, there's a theory of information itself that's interesting, but also doesn't give you the answer of how that interacts with matter and energy. So in some sense, if you want to have a theory of complex systems, it needs to integrate this interaction between matter, energy, and information. That's really what we're looking for. So to finish my talk in the last 10 minutes or so that I have, I just want to take you a little bit through, in some sense, what evolution by natural selection is doing in this context, what the brain might be doing, what human societies might be doing, and then finish there. And then hopefully we'll have a long discussion. So the properties of information, before I go on, just so that we're more or less clear on that. These are still things that people are trying to understand to some extent. But we know from thermodynamics, as I showed you, that information creation in general, there are some caveats to some of these, but requires energy. In order to order your kid's room, you've got to spend some energy doing it. And this is generally true. Information is also physical. This is this idea that exists always in some physical substrate. What that physical substrate doesn't matter so much, but it matters that it exists in some form. It's accessible to some other system in some other form. But you cannot have information out of matter and energy. As that is, it's also independent of substrate, and that's important to take into consideration. So this is, in some sense, why you can hope to have artificial intelligence. Intelligence is probably not to do with the goo of the brain. It's something it's doing in the sense of how it produces a loop between information that it captures, predictions that it generates, and how that interacts with the environment and so forth. I'll say more about that in a second. The thing that's very interesting is that, at least macroscopically, information is not a conserved quantity. Sandra said a little bit about this. But this is very important in economics. It's the idea that once you produce the knowledge of how to make a widget, lots of people can use that information. Once you know how to run a city, lots of other cities can use that information. In general, by looking up that information and accessing it and implementing it, you don't destroy it, which is not true when you deal with matter and energy. If you access that, you spend it. So information is special in that sense, and that's basically the sticky part that allows you to accumulate structure, is the fact that you can remember something, you can do something with that to access information, you can remember something else, and keep on recombining that information and creating something that gets more and more complex. The other part that's sort of interesting is that it's because this information can be shared that you escape many of the paradoxes of economics in terms of finiteness of resources and economic growth. So the other part that's interesting, which is the insight from biology, is that in some sense environments said generally, tend to select individuals that have the better information. So if your genome is better for your environment and express yourself as a more adapted phenotype, then you will do better. So the idea is that information then is selected in material sense. And so from this perspective, what I want you to think about is that complex systems are not things. They're not just the configuration that you see in a city or an individual. They're actually processes for creating, embodying, using, and selecting information. And it's really as a process that you start seeing what a complex system really is. So let me try to say what that process is and then give you some examples. So imagine that you have, for example, a gene. This is sort of interesting because you're familiar with what I'm about to say from statistics, for example, but you might not have thought about it that way. So you have, for example, a gene. This gene basically is, as you know, a piece of information in your DNA, but its ability is to actually build a phenotype, given that there's energy. So this gene is actually a piece of information that makes a prediction about the environment. That prediction is you and your behavior. It's the phenotype. It's a statistical prediction. And it's a material prediction. You are going to interact with the environment, and then you are going to perhaps acquire resources, have kids maybe, and then by that interaction and your success as a prediction, as to how well you do in that system, you will then propagate information or not. So there's basically a step of selection. So this is interesting because, of course, it can be sort of a stable loop. But if this information is so successful that procures a lot of resources, that makes a lot of matter and a lot of information, it can also run away and create more and more complexity. So this also happens with the brain. The brain, interestingly, what's special about the brain is that, yes, it's very good at recognizing complicated situations, but above all, it's a theory. It's a way of understanding the world. It's a model. It's a model of your body first, but then it's a model of what the world looks like. And that's what allows you to do better. And if your brain is very good and if it's learned well, it will allow you to also do well and keep on doing this. I'll say more about that in a second. So in some sense, at least the informational part of this is something you're very familiar with. It's basically Bayesian estimation. So you can see it this way. The information, the gene, if you wish, the update on the information is basically given in terms of the body it's created and its behavior, the phenotype, and the environment that that body interacted in. And that equation, that update, is basically saying that that body is a prediction. So this is basically the model that you implement. If you're familiar with Bayesian statistics and estimation, it makes sense. Otherwise, it may not make sense. Built on your previous information in the environment, given what previous information you had. So this basically gives you a scheme to just iterate yourself away. The interesting part that we don't know how to do very well in statistics is that this allows the information itself, the representation, to grow and to be embodied in many different ways. But essentially, this is what it's doing. It's basically doing a test of remembering, predicting, selecting, and keep on going. Okay, so here's biology. These are basically bacterial clones, I believe. And now these individuals are not. I mean, they're individuals in the sense that they're biological things, but they're basically, because they're clones, they have lots of the same information. So a lot of what's happening here is that although these individuals are in different, these cells are in different places, they're actually expressing the same information. So in that sense, they're not really individuals because they don't learn. They're individuals at some level, but they're not full-blown individuals. They don't have a lot of information. They're very redundant, just like very much in physics. In the brain, the thing that's very interesting is that the brain as a model of the world, and particularly the human brain, is actually endogenized a lot of this process. When you think about it, the thing certainly that we can do, we don't know if animals can do this, maybe they can do at some limited level, is that in biology, this selection effect, the selection step, is not done by the organism. It's done externally to the organism. So the process of evolution is not something that's contained in the biological entity. It's something that's a property of the biological entity as the expression of information plus the environment. That's what allows that cycle to go. But in the human brain, that's also true. Your behavior is tested in the world. But the human brain is able to endogenize some of this. You can think about whether it would be a good idea to have fish for lunch, and then you can decide whether that is good or not. And this allows you actually a tremendous power to endogenize that selection and think ahead. So we've had a project at Los Alamos before I moved to SFI called Synthetic Cognition, and this is a very applied project that explored an idea that we heard about yesterday, which is we have computers now the size of the brain. We had a very large computer at Los Alamos. We still do, but it's not as large as it used to be in relative terms. And so the idea is, if you only knew what these systems look like, could you build one? And so we tried, of course, and we've made a lot of progress, but of course we didn't do it, otherwise we would have heard about it. But the idea is that the essence of these models are that these models are models of the world. And this already happens at the visual system level. So you have visual imagination. You can do the experiment right now. You can imagine what you're going to have for lunch. Okay, so imagine that scene. We can all do it, easy. But you have absolutely no right to do that from a mathematical point of view if you think about it, in the following sense. I only told you that you're going to have lunch. I didn't tell you where, I didn't tell you when, I didn't tell you what might be for lunch. You had to put in, if you imagine a visual scene, all those details, and you had to structure them so that they made sense. There's a lot of information in that image that I have not given you. Where did that come from? So that came from the system, just like that hopfield network that was structuring itself to find those images. A lot of what you remembered and a lot of what you've experienced before got encoded in a way that can be triggered by a part of that information and create a scene. So that's how a brain or a genome is a model for the world. given some clues about it, it can produce behavior, it can produce predictions that are fully consistent, and that what allows you to do selection. So it's really this process of generating behavior, generating predictions, modeling the world, that is creating the extraordinary properties of what complex systems are. So, and it's also this selection of information that is producing individuals, in the sense that each one of these entities will have a different experience, will have a different selection procedure, and it will therefore not be a clone, not be an average like in physics. Okay, so obviously individuals, because though they have the same genomes, famous photograph there, I like. So, and this is the idea that if you learn, if you have different experience, you already see from their faces, that's why it's such a wonderful, they have a very different outlook in life, right? So these people will have a different life, but they're identical twins, but they're definitely individuals in that sense. And so one thing, just as I should have said, Zhengping Ji, he's here, he worked in the Brain Project. He'll be talking tomorrow about some of that work, I think. And tomorrow we'll also have a workshop on cities. Cities, of course, as you might imagine, are incredibly complicated things. How might we understand them? There are many ways in which, by looking at data, we've been understanding them. But in the great scheme of things, in the spirit of this talk, what is it that a large city is actually doing? When you look at that, that's New York, of course, you know, there's a lot of matter and energy, no doubt, but there's a lot of unusual configurations, right? There's a lot of structure there that's very interesting. So the way increasingly we understand cities is, you know, so one of the questions is, are these individuals or not, is that these systems really are creating a lot of the information that pervades human societies. And it's really in, again, the flows of energy and resources that come to the city and how they're distributed through these roads and so forth, and how they come to it in the first place through the urban system. And how what these cities do, which is mostly to deal with information, new algorithms to access new energy all over the urban system, that you can start understanding the real function of these systems. So if you think about it, cities are not there because they mine or because they grow vegetables, though that's nice to have organic vegetables there. They're there because they're doing something fundamentally different. They're finding ways in which all that labor and all that energy can be used better all over the world. And so it's not just that they do, but they do that in very indirect ways, of course, in human societies, but they do a lot of that. If you think about what made agriculture productive, what made manufacturing go a certain way, a lot of this was invented in large cities and then, of course, became something that invaded the rest of the world. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow, so that's an advertisement for tomorrow. But it's really a fundamental way, and it has been a challenge for us to understand how the informational part of this process actually exists in the space and in the energetics of the city. So those are sort of the questions. So finally, I just want to leave you with a picture and with a quote, which I think tries to unify these perspectives. It's very early days in complex systems, of course. We've seen this through this talk. We're dealing with very many different systems. But I think we tend to deal with them still, though we're trying to do better, from perspectives that are familiar to us. But in some sense, what's missing is sort of a calculus, a way of quantifying how information, matter, and energy come together in order to produce these loops in which information can at least be maintained and certainly grow, and at the same time, how it helps harness energy and resources and do all the wonderful things that we see around us. So one of our external faculty, Seth Lloyd, has written very interesting books about quantum mechanics, the universe, and information. And so I like this quote. It says, the more energy, the faster the bits flip. So energy has a lot to do with how fast you can do things. Earth, fire, and water, in the end, are all made of energy. Everything's made out of energy and matter, which is energy, as you know from Einstein. But the different forms that they take are determined by information. So that's really the stuff, the way the world is not degenerate, why it's not a goo, why it's not just, you know, some gray soup, is because it takes structure. And this structure interacts in interesting ways with matter and energy. To do anything requires energy. That's fundamental. It's the beginning. But to specify what is done and to do all these things around us that are novel and that are different and they're structured requires information. So the individual does matter when it embodies and creates and propagates information. So that's the message. And in many ways, what we need to understand about complex systems is what are the individuals in this very sense, and how is it that they make a living in terms of matter and energy, and how can that propagate this engine of creating complexity. Thank you. Thank you.
That leaves the floor open to questions, which I'm quite sure there's a lot.
George over there had one.
Hi, Luis. Luis, thank you very much for the talk. I have a question, which is, the talk is about how the individual matters in complex systems. You cite the example of the hopfield network and how that matters, the individual matters there.
Mm-hmm.
And I do agree with you, and another example would be perhaps in a gene, if you change one base pair, it might completely change the structure of a protein, for example, in some cases. But at the same time, complex systems seem to be highly robust to the removal of individuals, for example. In our brains, cells are dying all the time, neurons are dying all the time. In cities, people die and they are born, and the whole thing is in constant flow. In ant colonies, for example, if you remove individuals, the entire system, the functioning of the system is not really affected. So my question is, how would you reconcile these 2 points of view, that the individual matters, and it does, but at the same time that the functioning of the entire system seems to be quite independent of each individual person?
Okay, so I think that's what I was trying to say, but I'll say it again, which is that if an individual is redundant, okay, an individual, so unfortunately all these words, I had to use them very loosely and cover a lot of territory, I guess by choice, but if an individual is redundant in terms of information, has the same information as other parts in the system, then it's not really an individual. And it can die. That information is carried by others, by other parts of the system, by other structures. This is what you're referring to. So what I was trying to emphasize, and I know that the word's been used in different ways throughout the talk, is that in some sense the individual needs to contain unique information. That's what defines its individuality. And in that sense, that individual really matters, because if you lose that individual, you've lost something. The system's not as robust and as functional as it used to be. So I think what you said and what I said makes sense together, and in fact, that is the definition. Mm-hmm.
So to follow from that question, is that individual at a particular scale that matters? So the example of the cities, we can think of the individuals dying as being redundant to the city as a whole, but not to the particular family,
Right.
or something like that.
Exactly. So that's true. So information is always relative to something, right? That's something maybe I didn't emphasize enough. So an individual, I don't know, somebody with the same profession, many other thousands of people, suppose that they do exactly the same thing, is from the point of view of the city and the employer, perhaps fairly redundant. But from the point of view of the family, if it's the father or the mother, it's a unique position. So yes, it depends on the role of that entity in a context. So the information really is always specified in terms of that environment. So it's relative to it. So that's very important. With information, the word, of course, I used it fairly loosely and I cover a lot of territory. But it's very important to realize that information is always a relative quantity. When you look at a string of zeros and ones, okay, you may know that that's probably something that has to do with computers. But if you didn't know that, it doesn't make any sense. You have to be able to interpret it and use it for something. So this goes for anything. So basically, it's only if you can interpret it that is information to you. Otherwise, so information is always a relative quantity. I like to think that if you're a physicist, you know that measuring entropy per se is usually something that you can measure in different ways. For example, by slicing the system finely, you can have more entropy or less entropy. But the change in entropy, that's really what information is. That differential is what really matters. And that's a very important thing to remember. It's not really the configuration of something that matters. It's really, I wanted to say this maybe more clearly, so I'll just take the opportunity. It's how that changes. It's the change in configuration. So We really don't have in science, I would argue this, I think it's true, we don't have any theory of things. We don't have a theory of the way things look like, of configurations. This is something that often in biology and the social sciences we tend to want to describe how something looks, why it has that structure. All the theories of physics and evolution by natural selection, and increasingly, I think, interesting theories of cognition, for example, they're not theories of that. They're theories of the processes by which those systems change. And for example, in physics, often you find a fixed point of that change. That is a crystal or something simple. But it's really how systems change, the fact that you have an energy gradient or something will roll down it, or the fact that you have information between two systems that you can actually infer the state of the previous one. It's that change for which we have theory, and I think it's that change for which we'll have a theory of complex systems. We don't know why a tiger looks exactly the way it is, but we can say that under certain environments probably will evolve in a certain direction, and that may give it certain characteristics. But there's massive redundancy in that too. That's what's interesting, or at least ambiguity. It's really a theory of change that I expect we'll have in complex systems. Sorry, that probably confused you even more. But I think that that's an important distinction. Mm-hmm.
Two questions at the same time. You were first.
Is it on? Okay. So when you use information, you use it as though it's value neutral. So no, yeah. So I actually I want you to elaborate more on that. So is there better information or worse information, and how subjectivity play a role?
Thank you. That's a very important and wonderful question. So, as I said, it's always relative. So what might be information to you may not be to me, because you may be able to do something with it, and I may not be able to interpret. So that's the first thing. But the whole point is that I think when you read Shannon back in his foundational papers, this idea of universality in information transmission, which is what he was trying to describe. How is it that a channel may transmit information? What do I need to know in order to know the efficiency of that channel? And later on, how do you apply that, for example, to estimation of states? He made a very explicit choice that stays with us, and stays particularly people who use information theory till today, which is that I don't care what that information is, what it's used for. I just care about its statistical structure. What I was trying to convey to you today is that information in complex systems matters because first it's embodied, but then it procures something to the system because it always costs you. So at a minimum, it needs to procure energy and resources, so that's its value, so that it can go on and it can be reproduced and replicated and so forth. So there's always, in that sense, value to information. That value may be very hard to estimate. It's always statistical. So something that's very interesting and very hard when you're actually trying to use any of these ideas to do theory is, think about the brain, for example. Your brain hopefully will remember this conference. But why should it remember this conference? Is it going to be useful to you or not? Well, hopefully you don't know. You hope it is. But it's making an estimation of things that you should remember and you shouldn't remember. And in remembering, it's using energy. So every complex system needs to make this sort of calculus, which is a probabilistic calculus as to where to invest energy in order to remember, in the expectation that that information will be useful, so it has value. So we don't know how to do that calculus yet, almost for anything. And I think that that's the crux of having actually good theories of any specific complex systems, is try to understand and quantify what the value of information is for that complex system, which is exactly the question. So information, I think, in this context, what's interesting is that if you just stayed with information theory, you didn't have to worry about the value of information. But that's not enough to describe complex systems. You need to know what it might get you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to just offer some remarks, and maybe you can tell me what you think of it. The first of all relates to the idea of universality in physics. Basically, a lot of theories that are very powerful are very universal. But the problem with universal theories is always that basically the value of a theory depends on how easily it can be falsified. And the more specific something is, the more easily it can be falsified. So if it's more universal, it's basically, in a way, less useful. So that's sort of one...
Not necessarily, but okay.
But with a sleight of hand. Basically, it makes
There,
less...
you just, the physicists, if I may just answer right there, and then we'll go on with the second part of the question. So physicists, particularly theoretical physicists, like the world universality a lot because it means they don't have to care about lots of things, and that's very powerful, right, as you said. But it actually is always a qualified statement. It actually always says what it is that you don't have to care about. And once you know that, and some things are crucial, and some things are vastly non-crucial, and therefore are universal in that sense. But some things are very crucial, and on that basis you can falsify those theories. But it's very important to know, look, when we're looking at any complex system, that is a fundamental question. What is it that, when you look at the brain, could you get the brain by replicating it, by doing as well as you can with biology, as Henry Markram, somebody mentioned that yesterday, is trying to do, and others, and we attempted to do at Los Alamos? The answer is probably no. You need to understand what is it that the biology is doing fundamentally to do the function of the brain. But I bet you that a lot of what the biology is doing doesn't matter. In that sense, the computation of the brain might be universal in this qualified sense. So theories of physics are always universal in that sense. Some things are super crucial, and if you break them, you break it. But some things you happily can actually ignore and average over, and this gives you immense power to implement the same idea in different contexts. And that's the wonders of theory and theoretical ideas. So, yes and no.
Let me rephrase it then, to maybe mean it in a slightly different way. The theory becomes universal by ignoring certain types of information. And so my conjecture that I want to make here is that what makes the system complex and interesting is that there is this information that usually is ignored that becomes interesting. So in a way, I'd like your opinion on the idea that the more complex and the more interesting a system, the less universal a theory about it can be.
So this is what I was trying, I mean, we don't know the ultimate answer, so credit to your question. It's an interesting question. But I think that the answer is something like this. Could be wrong. What is happening is not that you need to know every detail. Otherwise, it's like the famous map of everything, right? You explain something by creating its replica. It's not an explanation. It's just a replica. It's not useful. The point is that some things matter more than others to explain certain things. Now, this sounds very subjective, but actually this is the way you describe the solar system. You ignore certain things in order, if you want to describe the orbit of the planets, it turns out it doesn't really matter. So that's the point, that what I think we will find in complex systems is that some things really matter to understand how the system evolves and works and so forth. And I think the general ingredients are the things that I talked about today. I know it was sort of a lot from different perspectives, but in some sense, it's really this interplay between information and structure as it relates to the material world, how that material world gets embodied and interacts with the environment, how that loops. But in that, there's tremendous universality in the sense that you introduced. You could have something that, might have an artificial being that's going through the same process as a biological being. We don't have that yet. But so the point is that if you do that same process, and this is the point why different complex systems may actually look the same from this perspective. When you're looking at what the brain is doing, it's essentially augmenting something that already exists in biological evolution, but it's very slow. It's this idea that if you can encode information about the world, the environment in which you live, you can live longer and prosper, so to speak. So, but you can do this much faster by completely different means. I mean, it's still biological, but it's a very different means. So the idea is that there's tremendous universality in the encoding of information, in the expression of information, in the uses of matter and energy. But fundamentally, the way these processes need to work together and what they do is essentially the same. And the role of theory is really to explore that universality, those extreme symmetries, but try to find exactly where they are and exactly where they're not, where the theory becomes falsifiable. So I sympathize with your question, but I think that the art of creating explanations of the world and creating theories is to really understand what matters and what doesn't matter, in what sense a theory is universal, in which sense it's totally brittle.
Okay. All right. So part two of the question is actually a little bit related in the sense that if you have a complex system, as you said very nicely, it actually isn't a thing, it's a process. And what's interesting about it is a process. Now, we have actually the same thing about individuals per se also. If you have a biological individual, for instance, you could say that the individual is encoded in the DNA, but biologically that's not true. The individual has a lot more bits of information as an organism than what is encoded in the DNA.
Exactly.
So the DNA basically is a recipe of how to cobble together an individual, including information from the environment, along the way.
That's the equation I wrote.
Yes, and so at the end you get the individual as a process. But that relates once again to the what I suspect is there's some kind of fundamental unknowability about what that complex system is going to do.
Yes, there are many things that are completely particular and accidental of the relationships of that information, even if you knew it, with the environment, even if you knew it. And that's true. And so I think I think this maybe is the nature of your question. That will always be very hard to explain and have theory for. But the fact that certain things need to happen in order for this process to go on, the fact that the information needs to be physically encoded in some substrate, that it needs to make a prediction in order to go on, that prediction has to be a form of interaction with the environment, and that it must be a selection procedure, or whatever you want to call it, in order to say if that was a good or bad prediction, and that this is often in terms of the value of information. All those things, I think, are common to many complex systems and can be embodied and encoded in a gazillion different ways. That's what's so interesting to me. But the detailed ways by which you get a tiger or you get you with your personal history and experience, to know that, you'd have to know everything that happened to you. And that, I don't think, is something that is the subject of theory in the usual sense. But it's something that you may want to know. And the question then is, if you wanted to know that, what is it that you would have to know? And you'd have to know a lot, I think. So that wouldn't be universal. I agree with you. But I don't think that is what's interesting for theory. But that's a judgment of value there to some extent. And when you look at theory anywhere, it has sort of this character. It asks for what are the general processes that are invariant over a large swath of phenomena. So that's in the sense that I was talking before. But thank you.
Louis, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. I was struck by your response to the question on information. And I'm wondering, even if we agree on what constitutes information, it's still not going to be uniformly or universally distributed. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the consequences of asymmetries in information.
Can you be a little bit more specific about what you mean by asymmetries? For example, in economics, it means something. Is that what you mean?
I'm thinking particularly about the asymmetric information in economics, so where you have consequences of moral hazard or adverse selection occurring. Does that mean that the complex system's role is to try and unearth those things, or is there some other role that a complex system as a process can play?
Well, if that asymmetry makes you, more successful in whatever way it is, then you will try to have it, right? So there's a sense in which that may be good for you, and that's what I was trying to argue is the basis of selection, and maybe the basis for the process of acquiring and using information. So I think that that's true. I think that because information is so useful, and because it's useful usually only once you express it, so information in your brain, I don't know what you're thinking, but by asking a question, I have some idea. So, and you can only transmit your ideas by writing them down or telling people. So it really needs to be embodied in behavior in some form. So there's the sense in which information, once expressed, can be acquired by others, and if it's useful, it will be acquired by others. So there's a sense in which you can create asymmetries, but there's also a sense in which, when useful, the value of information tends to spread very quickly. And because it's sort of curious when you think about it from physics. We're used to signals that decay with distance, that exist in matter and radiation. But with information, because you create these substrates that are kind of quite stable, information has actually in some way the sense that it lives forever, right? At least unless something catastrophic happens. So if it's useful, it gets recorded and it lives for a long time. So, so there's a sense in which it's available because it's useful, and we create lots of structures like writing and the internet and many libraries in order to have that information available. But on the other hand, it is the creation of some of these asymmetries, if I may borrow your word, that give certain people, certain institutions, certain nations some advantage, some biological organisms. That's usually temporary. But it's that process of creating new useful information, of using it, and of that, its diffusion, if you want to use a word that's not very precise, that makes this whole cycle go. So the information needs to exist, it needs to be expressible, it needs to have a value, and then it can be used to create more information, more expression of that information, and so it goes. So exactly, so that gives you a way of thinking also about economic things. What I was saying before is that often the calculus of, if I may use that word, of the value of that information is hard, right? And economics often is hard, and we can make models for it. But it's important that it has value, and that value is differential. There's one there.
Hello, yes. Thank you very much for this talk. I'm a physicist myself, and I'm very proud to be a physicist after this talk. I would like to ask a complex question that would involve econs,
so.
sociology, sustainability, finance, and even international laws.
I like it, okay.
You mentioned that information doesn't follow the laws of economics. It doesn't follow the laws of conservation. So it would just grow and grow and grow. So would it profit the world and society to abolish the IPs? Okay, that's an extreme question, but I would recalibrate that question. What if we reduce the IPs from 20 years, which used to be relatively short in the past, to, let's say, 15 years and eventually 10 years? Because right now, 20 years is a very long amount of time. With that, right now we see phase segregation in society. The rich are becoming too rich, the poor are becoming too poor. And that might break society. What if we reduce the amount of time for the IPs?
So I think that's a calculation you should do, but let me give you the sense of it. So, okay, let's see it at some abstract level. Why do you have IP, intellectual property rights? The reason, of course, anyone will tell you, is that you have to reward the people who put the effort in to come up with the idea, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it, and then everyone would be poorer for it. So this is important. I think it goes to the previous question. It goes to the value of information. Information that has no value, or that has no, even no, arguably no differential value, that's a more qualified statement, it's not worth getting. So you break the cycle. You know, it's not worth innovating, it's not worth creating information, whether you're a biological being or a company or an inventor. So in some sense, if you want to have creation of information, you need to create a way for the creator to derive some benefit. And I think one of the challenges in modern human societies is that by having an idea, you don't accrue, this again goes to the fact that information is physical and it needs to be expressed in some productive process, right? Otherwise, it's not useful yet. So it's only when you put those processes together that information derives a value. And so you need to create a system by which the creation of information derives that value. And if your idea produces, I don't know, an iPad that's produced in China that's sold in Japan, you may not see that money, and so it's not worth for you to have done it. So the question is, how might you create that in a way that maximizes the creation of information and the value of this information for society, I suppose, if that's what you want to do. So, and I'm not sure. So the point is that whether that calculus is good enough for the inventor, but it's good enough also for the people that derive the value from the idea, so that as a whole, the value of the information as a whole is maximal. And I don't know the answer in your specific question, but it's a very good question. And I think it's not only from the perspective of information itself, it's just not from the perspective of production itself, it's from the cycle of creation of information and its use that you need to do that calculation. So, so that's the way to think about it. I don't know what the result is, of course. And maybe that's technology dependent, because maybe the cycle, maybe the implementation time and costs are very different in different industries or something. And in that case, maybe if it's software, it should be shorter. And if it's, you know, something in heavy manufacturing, it should be longer. I don't know. But it's really, that's the essence of the problem. And I think maybe the kind of laws and regulations that we have are just kind of too dumb to deal with that. Alan.
Yeah, thoroughly enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
But now you started to dissect the meaning of information, and then of course it just grows and grows. The specific question would be, Richard Dawkins has been reflecting on this, of course, introducing the term memes.
Yes.
Is that something that is useful in this context, or is it not? And what about information and disinformation? Information in relationship to the democratic process and the control of human beings. I mean, this is a huge, huge field.
Yes.
But specifically the memes, what's your feeling on that?
Okay, so so here, I mean, that's a very powerful idea. I intentionally didn't go there. I think obviously he was coming from biology and from the idea of replication. But he said something very interesting already there, that whatever information you might have, let's say in your brain, a meme can only be transmitted if it's expressed in behavior, if you speak it, if you act it. So that's sort of the connection between the information and sort of the biological, I guess, substrate in that case. What I think he missed, I guess it was discussed, but is this idea of what does that get you? So in a lot of memes, as we think about them on the web or something, there's really not much cost and much benefit. And so they tend to have sort of this viral dynamics, perhaps, and so forth. But they don't affect a lot of change, I guess. So, and there's the question as to whether, so the dynamics is similar, but I think in that calculus is still too close to biology to understand how exactly that information is created, what was good for, if it was just neutral, and what the nature of its replication, if you will, is, which is, and what the selective process might be. I mean, the selective process is more or less simple to see because coming from biology, it's very simple. What is its reproductive number, right? What's its branching ratio? Will it multiply or will it die off? But I think when you start thinking about ideas and culture, it's more complicated than that. It's how they recombine, where they recombine, what their value is that actually creates complexity. But I think at the basic level, the mechanisms of having a piece of information in your head and how it's transmitted through, you know, a social process are essentially right. I'm not sure that the selfish meme is quite the explanation of complex systems. I think it's cute, but it's not enough to understand, say, how culture was formed. To your second question, which is much bigger and much harder, disinformation and so forth, you know, again, information is useful for different people in different ways. But interestingly, I think at the level of abstraction that we live our lives today and our societies exist in the sense that most of us here, we deal with information, but we're not dealing with its consequences directly. And often our ideas take decades, or depends, to express themselves in any value, and most of them might never have any value in any material sense. So it's really a sort of a probabilistic calculus that we're all doing, that sometimes some information matters a lot. And I think this opens up the window for disinformation or for the creation of irrelevant information, because it's very hard to know what matters. And what matters is subjective. But, and you know, because of our biology, some things we're just drawn to if something creates an emergency or a situation. A lot of politics has always relied on that. But that gets us into slightly more complicated issues. But you can sort of see them in this light, that they might have had biological value and that we still have the soft spots for certain things. But whether they have actual value and whether we can think about that, I think Sid was talking yesterday about how we integrate information, and if I can put it in these words, he was saying that education is very important. But education is really a way of building a very strong prior, if you want, something in your head that allows you to interpret the world and see the world and imagine the world in ways that are better. And I think some of the questions you're bringing up have to do with that, is if I give you a piece of information and you think it's junk, what are you going to do with that? And if you have a better prior, if you have better education, I suppose, you might be able to make a better judgment. But anyway, so sorry, that was a long-winded answer. But
Luis, thanks an awful lot for what is indeed a very stimulating talk.
Thank you so much.
I have I don't know whether it's a question, but I have an issue to some extent with one aspect of it.
Okay.
I very much subscribe to your definition, which you haven't said in exactly the same words, but I think that's what you want to go at, that complex systems is actually difference creation. And that a lot of what information is all about is difference creation. Now, the one difficulty I have with that is your role of the individual.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that is extremely Western cultural centered. And that came out in one of the questions that was asked a moment ago behind. There are clearly societies where that is not tied to the individual, where this is simply a question that something in some interaction actually comes up, is a novel thing, then gets accepted. And so, although I agree with you that the individual matters when it embodies and creates information, I would still argue that that is more about the information creation than about the individual, in a sense.
Okay. Is that, I mean,
Yeah,
obviously it depends what
yeah.
we mean by a bunch of those words, but
Yeah.
but let me say it then in my words.
Yeah,
Hopefully we'll
that's-
make some
that's
sense in
exactly
between.
what I was hoping.
Well, I think you said it yourself, that, well, creating a difference, depends what this difference is a difference of, okay? But let's just say you acquire a new way of farming or a new way of doing something that might be better. That was done certainly by some individual or small group of individuals, and then it might become common knowledge and so forth. But there's the sense in which, and I think goes to George's question, and it goes also to some of the other questions. So the information needs to exist at least in the brains of one person, since we're talking about people. But it's typically useful for many people. And it's really the interplay between the information and its material and energetic use, if you wish, that's important, ultimately. It's not just the information. It's not just about the material use. It's about the cycle by which these things come together. So in that sense, for many forms of production, which I think is what you're referring to from your talk and background, you see this widespread use of the same information, what looks like everyone knows the same thing, and degeneracy and everything is run together. But I think that reflects not so much the process of creation, as you said, but the process of what was created already, and sort of as a stock of knowledge, and its relationship to some, I guess, useful or satisfying value of that information. So I don't think we disagree fundamentally.
No.
I think that these things go together and they have interesting dichotomies as to how information is created, it's transmitted, and it's used. And in order to understand culture, for example, which you need to understand several of these things, not just one of them. But I think emphasizing that a culture is communal and everyone knows the same thing and that's the way it is a result for a static system, which may be true over maybe a slow system, or maybe, but there's in some sense a process that's going on that I think it's similar to many of the things I talked about more abstractly, that just happens at a scale that involves some of these processes where the individual does matter, but over a longer time scale. So I think we agree in any case. It's just a matter of emphasizing and using the words. That we don't
No, I think you're right.
Right.
Why I like what you just said is for me to actually understand what sort of the most important elements are in what you were presenting.
Right.
And I was focusing in first instance on this individual, and I think
Right.
now we're much better.
And in some sense, once knowledge is, knowledge, information, the words are slippery, is really important, for example, for production of something, agriculture, then you tend to see it that it becomes, either because it needs to be used by each person, everyone needs to know the same thing,
Or if it's very valuable, we create all these mechanisms to make it hyper-redundant, so that you create many libraries and you put it in many web pages, and so that if anything happens, it's still there. So those are for slightly different reasons, but there's a sense in which it becomes quite degenerate. But that escapes a little bit the logic of why it was created and how it's used, which is also important.
Okay. There is time for one further question.
There's one here, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, picking up on some of these themes from the way social scientists have looked at a lot of these questions have been looking particularly at what you might call a subset of memes, which is looking at norms. What are accepted standards of behavior? How do they spread? And in especially looking at international spreads of norms, there's a whole literature that looks at what is the existing ecosystem of norms, how does this new idea interact with those ideas. So I think it picks up on a lot of what you were just saying. But there's one specific piece that comes up over and over again in the literature, which is the importance of what's called a norm entrepreneur, that there's a driving force out essentially selling this standard.
Right.
And I'm wondering, in the kind of work that you've been doing, how would you think about that, and why would it be that you would have a need to have a norm entrepreneur to have these things spread?
So a norm entrepreneur, is that the word? Entrepreneur. I expect that it's the person that creates, or that creates the novelty. Is that?
It can be.
Or
there has been literature on the United States as a norm entrepreneur in setting certain standards for the international system. Individual NGOs, they can be any kind of actor.
I see. So, I mean, I think it speaks to the same process as I think you were saying, that I was trying to describe in fairly abstract terms. I think some of these things speak to how some of these norms are created in the first place, and some of them create to what are the sort of advantages of having this knowledge shared, and which have to do more with the value of that information or that structure, right? So, so often there's value in having systems that are that can talk to each other, so that they can share information and share other things. And I think the role of that exchange must be played again by somebody. And in some sense, it's an innovation for the system that doesn't have it. Whether it's useful or not, then it becomes a question. So, so I think human societies, of course, are very complex in that, again, the calculus of that value and who gets the value and who should produce the information. I think some of these questions are often hard to quantify. But I think the mechanism is the same. So it's just the words tend to be very different in different disciplines. But maybe we should talk over coffee, because I'm not sure I completely understood your question. But I think it's speaking to a similar process of creation, diffusion, and use of knowledge. And sort of as a process, you need to have certain roles under certain circumstances. And that's, I think, some of what you're referring to. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Louis. You actually gave a nice clue to the next step, which is coffee.
Okay.
Well, as I said, thank you. As we do this,
oh yes,
we give you, as they
the
say
mystery
now,
box.
a small token of appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.